So, the first half of the course this semester will deal with prophecy. By and large, in the Jewish tradition, the Torah is the central thing. In the Hebrew Bible, in the Christian tradition, traditionally, it's prophecy. This is because prophecy was traditionally taken to prophesy Christ. To a great degree, we'll be trying to undo the traditional Christian interpretation of prophecy in this course. Because what we try to do, what I try to do, is to locate the prophets in their own time and place and try to imagine a real-life situation in which these people were trying to communicate something and then figure out what it was that they were trying to communicate. We call this the historical critical method. It doesn't actually require a whole lot of history. History isn't really the point. The point is imagining a real-life situation, taking it for real, so to speak. Not everybody, even in this day and age, wants to read prophecy that way. This was brought home to me when I first came to Yale. I live out in Guildford. I was invited to give a talk on prophecy at a church in Brantford. And I did, what I thought was kind of prophecy 101, Amos, social justice, this kind of thing. And I noticed that there were 3 older women in the class who kept shaking their heads. And at the end of the class, one of them said, "Why didn't you talk to us about prophecy?" I said, "I did." I said, "No, prophecy is telling us what's going to happen." And what they were looking for, the reason they had come to the session, was to find out, what prophecy tells us is going to happen, how the world is going to end. Now, I figure that's fine for the National Enquirer. And there are people who treat religion as a subject that's fit for the National Enquirer. But I think it trivializes it. And it doesn't really take it seriously for what it is trying to say. Now, there are also still plenty of people who advocate a distinctively Christian reading of the Old Testament. And again, with these, I must say, I have no sympathy. They may have more honorable or more worthy reasons for doing it than my friends in Brantford. But still, I think one of the great Old Testament professors in this school was Brevard Childs. You will have a session in a section on his Canonical Approach at some point later on, but Childs, again, was very much advocating a Christian reading and what he called a canonical approach. This, again, I think, to a great degree, is taking the prophets out of their own context and putting them into a different one. Now, it's something you can do if you like that sort of thing, but it's not what we'll be doing here. So, any question, first of all, in general? If you have questions at any point, feel free. This class is not so huge that you can't talk. So, what is prophecy? Well, the word is Greek, prophetes, which can be taken either as predicting or speaking forth. And more properly, I think, taken as speaking forth. The classic Greek prophets were people who lived at the shrine of a god, and when you came with a request and wanted to know something from the god, the prophets were the people who spoke for the god. I guess the gods had a little difficulty communicating directly. But be that as it may, they were speaking forth as I say, in the traditional Christian interpretation, they were often taken really as predictors. In the kind of approach we take in this course, it's rather a matter of speaking forth what these people believe they were told by God. Now, we'll see that isn't at all a uniform thing. The idea of what God may say through you will vary enormously from one person to another, and it did so vary in the ancient world. But the prophets were supposedly inspired. They will say repeatedly that they stood in the counsel of the Lord, that they had some kind of ecstatic experience to ground their what they were doing. It's actually from the prophetic books that we get the idea that Scripture is inspired. There are large tracts of both Testaments that make no claim to be inspired. The idea that they're inspired is extended from the prophets. In the earliest phase, we have records of people that, when I speak of prophets here, I'm using the word as a kind of anthropological term, regardless of what they call themselves. And we have some such figures already from the middle of the second millennium. In a place called Mari on the Euphrates, let's see if one of these things writes. Well, I don't think that's much help. Let's try another one. Yeah. At Mari on the Euphrates, they had ecstatic people who went into ecstasy and delivered messages from God. Now, there's one story tells of somebody tearing a lamb apart with his hands and eating it raw. You may well go into ecstasy if you do that. You will find sometimes in the Hebrew Bible, more particularly actually in the later period, that there are techniques for going into ecstasy, which you are welcome to try if you like. Some are more attractive than others. But what you get in Mari actually is an interesting mix, because it's ecstatic, but it's also people who are delivering messages to kings. My colleague Bob Wilson, who most of you have had for a semester, has probably the best book on Hebrew prophecy. And he distinguishes, first of all, he talks about prophets as intermediaries, people who mediate between God and humanity. And he distinguishes between central intermediaries and peripheral ones. Now, central intermediaries are people who are located in a temple or in a palace near the center of power. Often they appear as advisors to kings. Peripheral intermediaries tend to be wild men, very rarely wild women. There are a couple of examples, but most of them male. Now, the wild type of prophet appears first in the Hebrew Bible. I should say, the word gets extended. Abraham, for example, is called a prophet. Moses is called a prophet, but they don't actually behave like prophets. Not in quite the same way. The first prophets that you come across in the Pentateuch are people like Balaam, who had the good sense to listen to his ass. And who was, of course, a pagan prophet. It's no reason you don't have to be Israelite to be a prophet. And you get a strange story in the book of Samuel, how Saul, well, first of all, you have Samuel, who was a seer. Now, seer is part of kind of the prophetic family, if you like. It's a term that can be applied to prophets from time to time, but it's a peculiar type. The gifts that Samuel had included the ability to find lost donkeys. This is not necessarily a profound religious occupation. But they can also take it upon themselves to anoint kings, to appoint people as rulers. But Samuel, insofar as he was a prophet, just seems to have been recognized as a person who was well connected to God and who might be a good person to find things out for you if you needed them found out. Also in the books of Samuel, you have a story about Saul, who at one point stumbled on a kind of revival meeting of prophets. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 19. And at this, the prophets were prophesying. What does it mean to say they were prophesying? Well, how many of you have ever been to a Pentecostal revival meeting? My guess is this is the kind of thing that was going on. Whether they were speaking in tongues, I don't know, but they were probably producing streams of sound. This is a well-attested phenomenon in different cultures. And that seems to have been actually one of the original meanings of what it meant to prophesy. Interestingly enough, at the end of that encounter, we're told that Saul stripped off his clothes and lay down naked all night. And that then people began to ask, is Saul also among the prophets? Now that's unusual behavior. He is not the last prophet to do that in the Hebrew Bible, but it's not normal behavior for them either. So the prophets, as they appear in a context like that, first of all, they always appear in packs. You don't typically get isolated prophets. Well, actually, central intermediaries are much more likely to be individual personalities. But even there, as we'll see in a minute, you are still likely to get large numbers of them together. But in many of these early cases, it's a group phenomenon where people go into ecstasy and then start behaving in strange ways that are thought to be inspired, let's say. Now, the first figure that you would call a central intermediary in the Hebrew Bible is probably the prophet Nathan. It is arguable that prophecy arises with a kingship and dies with a kingship. And really the reason for that, I think, is that kings employed prophets. We'll see this in a minute. Now, I don't know, how far did you actually get last semester? I meant to ask. Professor Wilson hasn't always finished the syllabus. How far did you get? Second Kings. Very good. Yeah. Well, we'll have a little bit of overlap here because I like to start with a few stories from the books of Kings, just to kind of warm up and get the feel of what prophecy is about. But you will find that kings employ prophets. They have them on hand as to consult before any big decisions. And so they're kind of advisors to the king, in a way, sometimes with very tense relations with other kinds of advisors to the king. And then when the monarchy disappears after the Babylonian exile, prophecy doesn't last long. And I figure, I don't think it's the case that the phenomenon of prophecy altogether died out, but that they didn't have a royal patron. And without such patronage, they don't enjoy the same prominence, and eventually that kind of fades off into the background. By New Testament times, you will still get characters like John the Baptist, but they are kind of isolated individuals. So, by way of setting the scene here as to what constituted normal prophecy in ancient Israel, the main thing I want to do this morning is consider a story in 1 Kings chapter 22. That's chapter 22. You do need to have your Bibles with you. Don't leave home without them. So this is a story that's set in the time of Ahab, although it doesn't seem to be a historical story about Ahab. And there is, there is another story told of how Ahab died. And in this one, it's just the king of Israel. That kind of vagueness often goes with folkloric stories or stories that are passed on, but it doesn't really matter too much which king it was. As you hopefully discovered last semester, the northern kingdom of Israel was much more important in its day than the kingdom of Judah. The Bible distorts that because the Bible comes to us through the hands of people from Judah. And for them, Judah was important. They also, I would say, distort the prophetic material by bringing it under the aegis of the law, because the law becomes much more important in the Second Temple period, and they tend to give the impression that the prophets were just preaching the law, when that is not what they were doing at all. So, in the northern kingdom, at one point in the 9th century, 9th, early 8th century is when the northern kingdom was at its peak. We know from an inscription of the Assyrian king Shalmaneser from 853 that King Ahab of Israel fielded 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers against him at a battle at Carchemish. And Damascus at that time only fielded 1,200 chariots, although they had 20,000 soldiers. So at that point in time, Samaria seems to have been as important as Damascus. Jerusalem was probably never that important. So a lot of the stories in the books of Kings are set in the northern kingdom. We'll look at more of them now next day in the stories about Elijah and Elisha. But this one now is set in northern Israel. So 1 Kings chapter 22. For 3 years, Aram is Syria, and Israel continued without war. Now, you don't have to think about it very long to realize that's an abnormal situation. It's even abnormal in modern times. And so the kings of Samaria and Jerusalem get together and say, we got to do something about this. And so they do. In the 3rd year, King Jehoshaphat of Judah came down to the king of Israel. At this point in time, they seem to be relatively good neighbors. And the king of Israel said to his servants, do you not know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, yet we are doing nothing to take it out of the hand of the king of Aram? Here's an excuse for starting a fight with Syria. He said to Jehoshaphat, will you go with me to battle at Ramoth Gilead? Jehoshaphat replied to the king of Israel, I am as you are, my people are your people, my horses are your horses. Such unanimity. But Jehoshaphat also said, inquire first the word of the Lord. In other words, are you sure this is something we ought to do? Would you please check it out first? Which gives you the impression that maybe Jehoshaphat wasn't quite so keen on going to war against Syria. So the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 of them. How do you get 400 prophets at the snap of your fingers?
They work for you.
Yeah, you keep them on the payroll. We also hear stories about hundreds of prophets who ate at Jezebel's table. Big table. But, he may not have had to pay them much, but at least he fed them. So now, when you have 400 prophets who work for you, and you let it be known that you want to do something, say, shall we take out a general in Iran? What do you expect those advisors who work for you to say?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, Your Majesty. And in fact, this is exactly what they do. They said, go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. You know, I have sometimes heard people complain that the historical method locks things in the past and makes them irrelevant. And I've never understood how anyone could say that. It seems to me human nature hasn't changed a whit. You know, that the way people behave in these stories is exactly the way they behave to the present day. So Jehoshaphat said, is there no other prophet of the Lord here of whom we may inquire? Further evidence that Jehoshaphat has cold feet about this. Are you sure you got them all? And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, there is one other by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah son of Imlah. But I hate him, for he never prophesies anything favorable about me, but only disaster. Have things changed in the modern world? I would guess not. So Jehoshaphat said, let the king not say such a thing. So the king of Israel summoned an officer and said, bring me quickly Micaiah the son of Imlah. Now the king of Israel and King Jehoshaphat of Judah were sitting on their thrones, arrayed in their robes, at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria. What would two kings and their courts be doing on a threshing floor? Well, the threshing floor was, for practical purposes, the town square. An open area inside the gate of a city, which was also the place where if you want to have a meeting, that's where you have it. And so that's what they're doing there, sitting on their thrones and arrayed in their robes. Get the picture, because the picture will be reproduced with different reference, even already within this chapter. And all the prophets were prophesying before them. Now, in this case, what does it mean to say that all the prophets were prophesying before them? I figured this was a pep rally. A pep rally before going to war against Syria. And what they do is they dance around, jump up and down, get very enthusiastic. Zedekiah, son of Kenana, made himself horns of iron. Now, this kind of street theater is very typical of the Hebrew prophets. People like Isaiah and Ezekiel will do actually some more colorful things. You will get analogous incidents happening in the book of Jeremiah. So Zedekiah made horns of iron. With these you will gore the Arameans until they are destroyed. And all the prophets were prophesying the same and saying, go up to Meroth Gilead and triumph, the Lord will give it into your hand. So the messenger who had gone to summon Micaiah said to him, look, the words of the prophets with one accord are favorable to the king. Let your word be like theirs. Isn't it a remarkable thing that 400 prophets agreed? Is it? How do you get 400 prophets to agree? You have a huddle. And presumably before the 400 prophets went in to give their response to the king, they had a huddle. And Kenana or somebody like him said, now boys, the word today is. Let's all be on the same page with this one. And so you get this remarkable unity when they go in. And Micaiah says, as the Lord lives, whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak. You can see why the king hated this fellow. When he had come to the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go up to Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall we refrain? He answered, go up and triumph. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king. But one has to infer, I think, that he must have said it in a sarcastic tone of voice, or that it was so out of character coming from him that the king found it incredible. So he says, how often must I tell you to swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? At which Micaiah says, okay, you asked for it. I saw all Israel scattered on the mountain like sheep that have no shepherd, and the Lord said, these have no master, let each one go home in peace. Translated into non-metaphorical language, it means,
King's going to die.
yeah, please go up to Ramoth Gilead. You're going to get killed. That's why he wants him to go up. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, what did I tell you? Did I tell you he wouldn't prophesy anything favorable about me, but only disaster? And then Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all the host of heaven beside him, to his right and to his left. Okay, first question. Is that a credible statement? Could a human being see God? What do you think? No. Who says no? And even in the Bible, who says no? God, a number of times. Are there exceptions to it? If you remember, Moses got to see God from behind, but he couldn't see him face to face. But now you will find Isaiah also will say that he saw the Lord. By the time you get to Ezekiel, the vision has gone a little bit blurry. It's hard to say what Ezekiel is seeing exactly. But there is a tradition more typical of southern prophecy, but evidently you had it here too, where prophets claim to see the Lord. Now, if you saw the Lord, would you recognize him? You may all be having mystical experiences, and just missing them. How would you recognize him? What does the Lord look like? What does he look like here? Yeah. Does he look like anyone else we have already met in the chapter? Just like the king. In other words, how is one to imagine God? Herodotus said, if horses could speak, they would say God was a horse, or the gods were horses. And here you imagine God as the most powerful human being you can imagine, the most exalted kind of being you can imagine, and that's the king. So he sees the Lord seated just like the king was seated, with his host around him to his right and to his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab so that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? Now, wasn't this a rather mischievous thing of the Lord to say? Is it credible to you that the Lord would set somebody up? Had he ever done this before? Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the textbook example. Harden Pharaoh's heart. You'll find it in, Isaiah even suggests that the purpose of his preaching is to make people guilty. Not to convert them, but just so that they will be guilty in what they do. Now, he says that the Lord says, who will entice Ahab? And one said one thing, and another. until a spirit came forward and stood before him. When it says a spirit came forward, this is the kind of being that we might call an angel. You know, the word angel really means messenger. But in the Hebrew Bible, you always have a whole heavenly host. Sometimes these are called simply gods. If you like, not God with a capital G, lesser gods, minor deities. But it's always assumed from the opening verses of Genesis, that God is not alone. This is why in Genesis he says, let us make this and that. It's the royal we, but the royal we has a council around him. And the Lord said, okay, how are you going to do that? And notice the Lord is open to suggestions. And he replied, I'll go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then the Lord said, you are to entice him, you shall succeed and go out and do it. So you see, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. But the Lord has decreed disaster against you. Now, one question is, why does Micaiah say that? Wouldn't it have been easier to say, you might think, that these people all huddled before they came in and agreed that they would say what you wanted to hear? Why does he not say that? Yeah, if he did that, he'd discredit the whole operation in a way. But here, he does not dispute that the false prophets are inspired. But what does this do for your faith in prophecy? It's not enough to know that the Lord has inspired somebody. You also have to figure out, what was the Lord up to? Did the Lord do this with malicious intent? And if the Lord can inspire people with malicious intent, you're in trouble. It will become hard to trust prophecy and anything. Now, this will all come home to roost later on at the time of the Babylonian exile. And the classic discussion of it is in the book of Jeremiah. How is the king to know which of them is right? After the fact, exactly. So if you're the king in this situation and you want to say, well, no, let's see which of them is right, what do? You go up to Ramoth Gilead, and if you get killed, you know that Micaiah was right. But it's a little bit late at that point. But in a way, that's the only satisfying criterion that you'll ever get. Jeremiah will offer some other criteria, one of which is all the true prophets, all the prophets before me, prophesied war, famine, and pestilence. If a prophet prophesies peace, you can afford to wait and see. So, in other words, Jeremiah suggests that the odds are that somebody who prophesies doom and disaster is more likely to be right. Well, this probably was in accordance with the general experience of life in the ancient world, and especially in a place like Judah, disaster was much more likely to come along than anything else. But again, is there anything else that could be said that might add to the credibility of Micaiah? Well, let's finish the story. Zedekiah, son of Kenana, came to Micaiah and slapped him on the cheek and said, "Which way did the Spirit of the Lord pass from me to speak to you?" Micaiah replied, "You will find out on that day when you go to hide in an inner chamber." And the king of Israel then ordered, take Micaiah and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and Joash, the king's son, and say, put this fellow in prison, feed him on reduced rations of bread and water until I come in peace. And Micaiah said, if you return in peace, the Lord has not spoken through me. And luckily for Micaiah in this story, the king does not return in peace. What did Micaiah have to gain? Reputation? Good point, actually. Why do we have the prophets that we have? My guess is, that this story is probably accurate in the general sense that the prophets we have in the Bible represent about 1 in 400. That's about the proportion of them that prophesied the way we think of with an Amos or a Jeremiah. The vast majority of them would have been like Hananiah saying, yes, your majesty, whatever the king asks. So he did have a reputation to gain, but at some cost, didn't he?
He was put in prison. He was put in prison.
He was put in prison. If the king had come back alive, what would have happened to him?
He would have been executed.
Probably so, yeah. You know what happens to Jeremiah later on? He gets dropped down a dry well. And luckily for him, he gets out before the rain. Or the water supply might have been contaminated. But, Georgia.
But isn't that an incentive, if you're reading that, an incentive to future kings to put up with prophets that's telling you what you don't want to hear, because that would be better counsel than yes men?
Can you name a king who thought of it that way? For that of it, can you name a modern ruler who thinks of it that way? Yeah. Well, he does, and that's a very interesting story. In a way, the story of David and Nathan is the counterpoint to Elijah. It's the one case where a king comes around, although he tends to come around after the fact. That David has a peculiar knack of doing that which he wants to do, and then doing penance for it afterwards, so that he can come off looking well. But he's probably the only case, actually, none springs to mind otherwise of kings, who snap to when a prophet tells them something. So the odds of gaining any kind of personal advancement, of becoming a more trusted advisor, those odds were pretty long, I would say. This was not something that was likely to happen for Micaiah. And I figure, if there was a reason to trust Micaiah, that was it. He had everything to lose and very little to gain. And so, you might say, the king would have done better in any case to be cautious, and to accept the more cautious policy. But again, this is not the way kings think. It's not the way rulers think, either in the ancient world or in the modern world, I would think. So, what do you make of this story? And what does it tell you about prophecy? Yes.
That prophets are still subject to the downfall or the issues with humanity?
Oh, yeah. Prophets are very human agents. In the end of the day, how do you ever know that somebody is inspired?
Don't.
So that is really a judgment as to whether you agree with them. Is what it comes down to. There's no objective way other than waiting to see if you do get killed in battle, which is not a very satisfactory criterion. Anybody else?
Interesting that even if prophets disagree
agree, they can still both be inspired.
They can still both be inspired. That's a good point, actually. And, they may both quite sincerely believe that they're inspired. Yet that doesn't do a lot, really, to help with the credibility of prophecy either. But still, it's a point worth noting, I think. But I think, what you will find as we go along is that the prophets who are highlighted, the prophets who survive, are the ones like Micaiah ben Imlah, who, as we say nowadays, speak truth to power, who go against the grain and become memorable for that reason. Now, somebody mentioned there the case of Nathan and David, and it's maybe a good one to bring in here as a counterpoint. I usually like to set that off against the story of Elijah, which we will talk about on Wednesday, especially in the case of Naboth's vineyard. Most of the prophets go in with both guns blazing. One of the favorite modes of prophetic speech is the curse. It's, may the dogs lick up your blood kind of thing. You have it with Elisha and Jezebel, for example. Nathan is the great exception. And, if you recall for a minute how Nathan behaves, this is a case where David has already disposed of Uriah the Hittite because he wants his wife. Nathan, one would assume, didn't need a special revelation to figure that out. It was probably obvious enough what had happened. His way of getting to David is by telling him a story about the poor man's little ewe lamb, one of the great tearjerkers in the Bible. This man who had this favorite little ewe lamb that he even let drink out of his cup in a most unhygienic manner. But David gets moved by it, and he empathizes. And then Nathan gets him by saying, "You are the man." What makes it possible for Nathan to win David over that way when no other prophet has that kind of rapport with the leader? Well, you could say that David was just a better person. There's a good book about, there are a couple of good books about David, including one by Joel Baden and another by Baruch Halpern, which referred to him as, among other things, a murderer, adulterer, liar, you name it. There's hardly a sin in the catalogue that David doesn't commit at some point, but he still manages to come off looking good at the end of it. So, there may have been something in the character of David, but in any case, I think it depends on a relationship. That Nathan is trusted by David. So there's some prior history involved. I say this, just for the benefit of those of you who may be going into ministry and are contemplating taking up a prophetic style. I think Nathan's approach is probably a better one to try out than what you will typically get from Elijah or Amos, where you go in just denouncing people from on high. But in order for it to work, you have to have a certain rapport with your audience. And I think what most of the prophets do, in fact, it isn't done in any great hope of changing anything, but just of setting the record straight. It's like passing a vote for impeachment in the House. You don't really believe anything is going to come of it, but you put it on the record. I think that's what most of the prophets are doing, actually, is putting things on the record. Except, in the rare case like Nathan. Thoughts? Questions? any sort. Yes.
I'm just thinking about the idea of, like, determining what the future is going to look like and speaking for it.
Yeah.
The mild difference between that, because speaking for it can be a hope towards a future, as opposed to, saying it's going to happen.
Oh, yes. I'm not giving you a summary of the whole course on prophecy just yet. There is quite a bit of variation that will come up, and there certainly are plenty of prophetic passages where they articulate a vision for the future. One that comes to mind is Isaiah chapter 11, where the wolf will lie down with the lamb. A prophecy of the creation of zoos, right? Well, outside of zoos, you don't see it happen very much. But it's a vision, not to be taken literally. It's not really telling you just what's going to happen. It's telling you what you would like to happen, what you would want to happen, maybe something you ought to work towards. And equally on the other side, when a prophet like Amos comes along and he says, God is going to wipe you off the face of the earth. I don't know how far you can attribute that to the fact that he was an astute observer of Assyrian power. That's not impossible. But it may also be that he was just saying, and I hope God will wipe you off the face of the earth. That it's more an expression of what you think would be good or what you think ought to happen. So these are all varieties of the use of prophetic speech. I don't think you get many cases where they're actually predicting for the sake of predicting. It's usually more a judgment on people one way or the other. So on Wednesday, yes, please.
How would a king determine, who is a prophet and who is not? What age does that happen?
Well, in the earlier books of the Hebrew Bible, you always hear the sons of the prophet. Now, that gives the impression that there were families. Like priesthood was something that was passed on in families. If your father was a prophet, the odds are you would be a prophet. And I don't know at what point you begin to utter your own prophecies. Probably in your teens somewhere, I would guess. Now, we'll meet on Friday, we'll discuss Amos, who famously said, I am not a prophet or the son of a prophet. By which he meant, well, he probably meant quite literally, that his father wasn't a prophet, but also that he wasn't a member of a prophetic guild. He was a freelancer. And with somebody like that, it's when the Spirit moves them. With Amos, I imagine he was probably a mature adult before he ventured out uttering his prophecies. There isn't any known coming out ceremony for prophets. Prophets will often tell you that they realize they're prophets when they have this vision where they're standing in the counsel of the Lord. But you have no way of checking on that. It's much easier. It's easier to say, I have stood in the counsel of the Lord, than it is to find out whether you have or not. Okay, so we'll see another mode of prophecy in the stories of Elijah and Elisha on Wednesday, and then move on to Amos on Friday.